When Alex stepped onto Flight 2317 that morning, she had no idea this ordinary shift would become the most memorable day of her 8-year career as a flight attendant. The autumn sun was barely peeking through the airport windows as she went through her usual pre-flight routine, checking safety equipment and preparing the beverage cart. The first-class cabin was nearly full that morning, mostly with business travelers typing away on their laptops or scrolling through their phones. In seat 2A sat a gentleman in a simple gray sweater and jeans. Nothing about him suggested he was any different from the dozens of other passengers Alex served every day. The flight took off smoothly from Chicago O'Hare, heading towards San Francisco. About an hour into the journey, Alex began the beverage service. She had already served half the first-class cabin when the aircraft hit an unexpected patch of turbulence. Despite her years of experience and steady hands, the sudden jolt sent the freshly poured cup of steaming coffee flying directly onto the passenger in 2A. "Oh my goodness, I am so terribly sorry," Alex exclaimed, immediately reaching for napkins. The hot coffee had splashed across the gentleman's sweater and laptop. Her heart raced as she watched the dark stain spread across his chest. In all her years of service, this was her worst nightmare coming true. The passenger, however, surprised her with his reaction. Instead of the anger she expected, he looked up with a gentle smile. "These things happen," he said calmly, helping her clean up the spill. "I've been on enough flights to know turbulence isn't exactly predictable." Alex's hands trembled slightly as she continued to dab at his sweater with napkins. "Please, let me pay for the dry cleaning," she offered, knowing it was the least she could do. "And your laptop, I hope it's not damaged." "Don't worry about it," he replied, closing his laptop and carefully wiping it down. "The laptop seems fine, and this wasn't my favorite sweater anyway." His easygoing attitude only made Alex feel more guilty. What happened next would change the course of Alex's day, and ultimately, her career. As she was apologizing for the third time, another passenger from across the aisle leaned over and whispered something that made her blood run cold. "Do you know who that is?" "That's David Chen, the CEO of Pacific Airways." Alex felt her stomach drop. Pacific Airways wasn't just any airline, it was one of the largest carriers in North America, and more importantly, it was the parent company of the very airline she worked for. She had just spilled hot coffee on her boss's boss's boss. The rest of the flight became a blur of anxiety for Alex. Every time she passed by seat 2A, Mr. Chen gave her a reassuring smile, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her career was over. She had heard stories of flight attendants being let go for far less serious incidents. During the final beverage service, Mr. Chen pressed the call button. Alex's heart jumped to her throat as she approached his seat. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, trying to keep her voice steady. "I noticed your name tag earlier, Alex, right?" he said, his voice warm and genuine. "I wanted to tell you something. Throughout this whole flight, even after the coffee incident, I've been watching how you interact with passengers. Your attention to detail, your genuine care for everyone's comfort, and most importantly, how you handled a stressful situation with grace, these are exactly the qualities we value at Pacific Airways." Alex stood there, stunned. This wasn't at all what she had expected to hear. Mr. Chen continued, "We're actually launching a new training program for flight attendants, focusing on customer service excellence. Would you be interested in helping develop and lead it?" The conversation that followed would mark the beginning of an incredible new chapter in Alex's career. Mr. Chen explained his vision for elevating the airline service standards, and how he believed someone with Alex's experience and natural ability to connect with passengers would be perfect for shaping the program. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Alex found herself holding Mr. Chen's business card, still trying to process how spilling coffee on a passenger had somehow led to the opportunity of a lifetime. The incident that she thought would end her career had instead opened an unexpected door. When the aircraft touched down at San Francisco Airport, Alex had learned perhaps the most valuable lesson of her career: sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities, especially when we handle them with honesty and grace. As passengers began deplaning, Mr. Chen stopped briefly by the galley where Alex was standing. "I look forward to seeing what you'll bring to our training program," he said with a smile. "And Alex? Maybe we should stick to serving water during the first few training sessions." They both laughed, and for the first time since the coffee incident, Alex felt completely at ease. Sometimes life's most embarrassing moments have a funny way of turning into its biggest blessings. The following week, Alex found herself walking through the gleaming glass doors of Pacific Airways corporate headquarters in San Francisco. The building's modern architecture and bustling atmosphere were a far cry from her usual workplace at 35,000 feet. Clutching her portfolio and smoothing down her blazer, she couldn't help but think about how drastically her life had changed in just 7 days. The training department's conference room was already filled with senior management when Alex arrived. Among them sat Mr. Chen, who greeted her with the same warm smile she remembered from the flight. As she took her seat at the large oval table, she noticed how different he looked in his formal business attire compared to the casual sweater he'd worn on the plane, the same one she'd accidentally decorated with coffee. "Before we begin," Mr. Chen addressed the room, "I want to share why I chose Alex to lead this initiative." He went on to recount the coffee incident, but not in the way Alex expected. Instead of focusing on the spill, he described how she had maintained her composure, showed genuine concern for his comfort, and continued to provide exceptional service to other passengers despite her obvious distress. "That's the kind of real-world experience and natural customer service instinct you can't teach from a manual," he concluded. "And that's exactly what we need to build into our new training program." Over the next few hours, Alex found herself deeply immersed in discussions about revolutionizing flight attendant training. Her years of experience dealing with everything from minor inconveniences to major emergencies gave her unique insights that the corporate team hadn't considered. She shared stories about handling difficult situations, calming anxious passengers, and creating memorable moments at 35,000 feet. During lunch break, Mr. Chen pulled her aside. "You know, Alex, when I first started in this industry, I was a baggage handler," he revealed, surprising her. "I learned more about customer service watching bags come down that carousel than I ever did in business school. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places, like having coffee spilled on you at 35,000 feet. As the day progressed, Alex's confidence grew. She found herself suggesting ideas she'd been thinking about for years but never had the platform to share. She proposed incorporating real-world scenarios into training sessions, teaching new flight attendants how to handle not just procedures, but people. "What if we created a program that focuses not just on service protocols, but on reading people?" she suggested during the afternoon session. Every passenger has a story. They might be flying to a wedding, a funeral, a job interview, or coming home from military service. Understanding these human elements makes all the difference in how we serve them. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in enthusiastic discussion. Even the most skeptical executives were nodding in agreement. This was exactly the fresh perspective they'd been looking for. By late afternoon, Alex had been officially appointed as the head of the new Enhanced Customer Experience Training Program. Her role would involve not only developing the curriculum but also traveling to different bases to train new flight attendants and refresh veteran crews. As she packed up her notes at the end of the day, she found a handwritten note from Mr. Chen. "Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who know what it feels like to make mistakes and learn from them. Welcome aboard." Walking out of the building that evening, Alex paused to look up at the setting sun reflecting off the glass towers. She thought about how different her life had become in just a few days. The coffee spill that she thought would end her career had instead launched it in an entirely new direction. That night, as she called her mother to share the news, she couldn't help but laugh at the irony. "Mom, remember how you always told me that everything happens for a reason?" she said. "Well, apparently sometimes that reason is spilling coffee on your future boss." Her mother's wisdom echoed through the phone, "Sweetheart, it's not about the mistakes we make, it's about how we handle them afterward that defines us." As Alex prepared for bed that night, she looked at her flight attendant uniform hanging in the closet. Tomorrow, she would start writing the first draft of the new training manual. Her story would become part of it, not just the coffee spill, but the lessons learned about grace under pressure, the importance of genuine care, and how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best opportunities. She set her alarm for early the next morning, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for the first time in her career, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, even if she had to spill some coffee to get there. 3 months into her new role, Alex was surprised by how much her life had transformed. Instead of serving drinks and demonstrating safety procedures, she now found herself standing in front of a classroom full of eager flight attendant trainees, sharing experiences and teaching them the art of exceptional service. Today's class was particularly special. It was the first full implementation of her new training program, and Mr. Chen himself had decided to sit in and observe. As she looked around the room, she saw 30 fresh faces, all ready to embark on their aviation careers, just as she had been 8 years ago. "Let me tell you about the day that changed my entire perspective on customer service," Alex began, making eye contact with her students. "It started with what I thought was the biggest mistake of my career." The room fell silent as she recounted the coffee incident, drawing out the lessons learned from what could have been a disaster. One of the trainees raised her hand. "But weren't you terrified when you found out who he was?" she asked, glancing nervously at Mr. Chen, who sat quietly in the back of the room. "Absolutely terrified," Alex admitted with a laugh. "But that's actually the first lesson I want you all to learn today. Every passenger on your flight deserves the same level of service and respect, whether they're the CEO of an airline or a student flying home for the holidays." Throughout the morning session, Alex led the class through various scenarios, using interactive role-play exercises she had developed. The trainees practiced handling difficult situations, from dealing with anxious passengers to managing unexpected delays. But more importantly, they learned to see beyond the immediate problems to the human elements beneath. During the lunch break, Mr. Chen approached her. "You know what impresses me most?" he said, as they watched the trainees discuss the morning's lessons over their meals. "You've managed to turn a moment of panic into a teaching tool that will impact thousands of passengers' experiences." Alex smiled, remembering her own journey. "I've learned that sometimes the best way to teach is to be vulnerable, to show that we're all human and we all make mistakes. It's how we recover from those mistakes that matters." The afternoon session focused on what Alex called the human touch, her innovative approach to customer service that went beyond the standard protocols. She shared real stories from her years of flying, the time she helped calm a child having an anxiety attack, how she assisted an elderly passenger who was flying for the first time since losing his wife, and countless other moments that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to truly serve others. Being a flight attendant isn't just about serving drinks or demonstrating safety procedures, she explained to her captivated audience. It's about being present in some of the most important moments of people's lives. You might be serving someone who's flying to their dream job interview, returning from a military deployment, or heading to their first grandchild's birth. As she spoke, Alex noticed one of the trainees wiping away tears. The young woman later shared that she had been nervous about whether she was cut out for this career, but Alex's stories had reminded her why she wanted to become a flight attendant in the first place. Near the end of the day, Alex introduced her favorite training exercise, one she called the spill scenario. Trainees had to handle various types of in-flight accidents while maintaining their composure and ensuring passenger comfort. "Remember," she told them, "it's not about the spill, it's about how you handle it." Mr. Chen joined in during this exercise, playfully volunteering to be the passenger in one of the scenarios. The trainees were initially nervous about practicing with the CEO, but his participation helped demonstrate exactly what Alex had been teaching, that genuine care and professionalism matter more than titles or positions. As the training day drew to a close, Alex felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Looking at her students' eager faces, she could see that they had absorbed not just the procedures and protocols, but the heart of what she was trying to teach, the importance of human connection in customer service. One of the trainees approached her after class. "You know, when I started this training, I thought being a flight attendant was just about following rules and procedures," she said. "But you've shown us it's so much more than that. It's about making a difference in people's lives, even in small ways." That evening, as Alex packed up her training materials, Mr. Chen stopped by her classroom one last time. "I spilled my coffee in first class today," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "The flight attendant handled it beautifully, almost as well as you did. I think your training program is already making a difference." Alex laughed, remembering how that spilled coffee had set everything in motion. As she walked to her car that evening, she couldn't help but feel grateful for how things had turned out. What had started as a mortifying mistake had grown into something much bigger than herself, a whole new way of training flight attendants to see their role not just as service providers, but as an essential part of their passengers' journeys. She had learned that sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as our worst mistakes. And now, she was teaching others to see those moments not as disasters, but as chances to show their true character. 6 months into her role as head of training, Alex found herself facing her biggest challenge yet. Pacific Airways was preparing to launch a new international route network, which meant training hundreds of new flight attendants across multiple countries and cultures. The pressure was mounting, but she was determined to maintain the personal touch that had made her program so successful. One particularly busy morning, as she was reviewing training materials in her office, her phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Chen. "Need you in the executive boardroom. Emergency meeting in 15 minutes." Her heart skipped a beat. Emergency meetings were rarely good news in the airline industry. When she arrived, the boardroom was packed with executives, their faces serious. Mr. Chen stood at the head of the table, looking at a series of graphs and charts displayed on the wall. As Alex took her seat, she noticed one chart showing customer satisfaction scores. They were soaring, especially in areas where her trainees had been deployed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Chen began, "what you're looking at is the result of Alex's training program. In just 6 months, we've seen a 40% increase in positive customer feedback. But now, we face a new challenge." He clicked to the next slide, showing their ambitious international expansion plans. "We need to scale this success globally." Alex listened intently as Mr. Chen outlined the challenge. The airline was planning to open routes to Asia, Europe, and South America within the next year. They needed to train local crews while maintaining the same level of service excellence that Alex had established. "Alex," Mr. Chen turned to her, "we need you to develop a global version of your program. Can you do it?" The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Alex took a deep breath, thinking about the complexity of the task ahead. She would need to consider cultural differences, language barriers, and varying service expectations across different regions. But then she remembered something important. At its core, her program wasn't just about procedures, it was about human connection. And that was universal. "Yes," she replied confidently. "But I'll need to modify the approach. What works in Chicago might not work in Shanghai or Sao Paulo. We'll need to understand local customs and expectations while maintaining our core principles of genuine care and attention." Over the next few weeks, Alex threw herself into research, consulting with cultural experts and veteran flight attendants who had worked international routes. She began to see how her coffee spill story, which had become a cornerstone of her training program, could be adapted to resonate with different cultures while maintaining its essential message. She developed new scenario-based training modules that incorporated cultural nuances. For Asian routes, she emphasized the importance of respect and indirect communication. For European services, she focused on the balance between professionalism and approachability. For South American routes, she highlighted the value of warm, personalized interactions. During this time, she received an unexpected visit from a flight attendant who had gone through her first training class. "You wouldn't believe what happened last week," the young woman said excitedly. "I had a passenger spill wine all over himself in first class. Instead of panicking, I remembered your story. I handled it calmly, and guess what? The passenger turned out to be a famous food critic. He wrote about the excellent service in his column." These kinds of stories kept coming in, each one reinforcing that her approach was working. Flight attendants were learning to turn challenging moments into opportunities to showcase exceptional service. One evening, as she was finalizing the international training materials, Mr. Chen stopped by her office. He found her surrounded by cultural guides and translation notes, completely absorbed in her work. "You know," he said, making her jump slightly, "when I spilled coffee on that flight, I never imagined it would lead to this." He picked up one of her training manuals, now translated into Mandarin. "You've taken a simple incident and turned it into a global teaching moment." Alex smiled, remembering how far she'd come from that turbulent moment. "I've realized that while service standards might vary across cultures, the fundamental human desire to be treated with kindness and respect is universal." That night, as she drove home, Alex reflected on her journey. From a flight attendant who spilled coffee on her boss to someone responsible for shaping the customer service experience of an international airline, it seemed almost unreal. Yet here she was, preparing to take her program global. She thought about all the future flight attendants who would go through her training program, each of them learning not just how to serve passengers, but how to connect with them as human beings. They would learn that mistakes aren't career enders but opportunities to demonstrate character and professionalism. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone pinged with an email. It was from an airline in Dubai, asking if she would consider consulting with them on their training programs. Word of her success had begun to spread beyond Pacific Airways. Alex smiled, thinking about how one spilled cup of coffee had created ripples that were now reaching across the globe. Sometimes the biggest mistakes really do lead to the most amazing opportunities, you just have to be brave enough to learn from them and willing to share those lessons with others. That night, as she sat on her patio looking at the stars, she started drafting ideas for her next big project. The coffee spill that once made her fear for her job had become the cornerstone of a revolution in airline customer service training. And this was just the beginning. 1 year into her role as Global Training Director at Pacific Airways, Alex found herself standing in front of a mirror in a Shanghai hotel room, adjusting her suit jacket. Today marked the launch of her international training program in Asia, and the butterflies in her stomach reminded her of that fateful day with the coffee spill. The training center buzzed with energy as flight attendants from across Asia gathered for the inaugural session. Through her translator, Lee, Alex could hear the excited chatter in various languages: Mandarin, Korean, Japanese, and Thai. The diversity in the room perfectly represented the challenge she'd been working to address: how to maintain consistent service excellence across different cultures. As she prepared to begin, she noticed a familiar face slipping quietly into the back of the room. Mr. Chen had flown in especially for this launch, though he hadn't told her he was coming. He gave her an encouraging nod, and she felt a surge of confidence. "Today," she began, as Lee translated her words into Mandarin, "I'm going to tell you about a moment that changed not just my career, but my entire understanding of customer service." The room fell silent as the story was relayed in multiple languages, and Alex watched as understanding smiles spread across faces. But this time, she told the story differently. She'd learned that in many Asian cultures, public mistakes were seen as deeply embarrassing. So she focused on how the incident had transformed into an opportunity for growth and learning. She watched as initial looks of horror at her mistake turned to nods of appreciation at the lesson. During the morning break, a senior flight attendant from a Chinese airline approached her. "In our culture, we fear making mistakes because we worry about losing face," she explained. But your story shows how we can learn from these moments instead of being defeated by them. This interaction gave Alex an idea. She modified her afternoon session on the spot, asking attendees to share their own stories of challenging moments and how they handled them. The activity broke through cultural barriers as flight attendants from different countries found common ground in their shared experiences. One flight attendant shared a story about helping a passenger who couldn't speak any common languages but was having a medical emergency. Another talked about resolving a cultural misunderstanding between passengers from different countries. Each story added a new dimension to Alex's training program. During lunch, Mr. Chen joined her at her table. "You've done something remarkable here," he said, watching the room full of flight attendants engaged in animated conversation across cultural and language barriers. "You've created a universal language of service excellence." The afternoon session focused on practical applications, with Alex introducing her signature, spill scenario exercise. But she'd adapted it to include cultural considerations, different ways of apologizing, varying cultural expectations about service recovery, and diverse approaches to maintaining dignity in challenging situations. As she watched the trainees practice these scenarios, she saw them naturally incorporating their own cultural insights while maintaining the core principles of genuine care and professionalism she'd emphasized. It was exactly what she'd hoped to achieve, a perfect blend of global standards and local sensitivities. Near the end of the day, she received news that would once again change the trajectory of her career. Pacific Airways' customer satisfaction scores in their initial Asian routes had skyrocketed, and other airlines had taken notice. She'd received invitations to speak at international airline conferences and requests for consultation from carriers around the world. That evening, at a small celebration dinner with the training team and Mr. Chen, Alex found herself reflecting on her journey. "You know," Mr. Chen said, raising his glass in a toast, "when I first felt that hot coffee on my sweater, I had no idea I was about to discover someone who would transform our entire approach to customer service." Alex smiled, remembering how terrified she'd been in that moment. "And I had no idea that spilling coffee would lead me to Shanghai, teaching people from all over Asia about the art of service." As she looked around the table at her international team, Lee from China, Yuki from Japan, Min from Korea, and others, she realized she'd created something far bigger than herself. Her program had evolved into a global movement, breaking down cultural barriers while maintaining the essential human touch that made service truly exceptional. Later that night, in her hotel room, Alex received an email that brought tears to her eyes. It was from one of her first trainees, now flying international routes. The flight attendant shared a story about how she'd helped a frightened young Chinese student traveling alone to America for the first time, making her feel safe and cared for throughout the long flight. "I remembered what you taught us," the email read. "It's not about just serving passengers. It's about being present in their life journeys. Thank you for teaching me to see beyond the uniform and procedures to the human moments that matter." As Alex looked out over the Shanghai skyline, she thought about how far she'd come from that turbulent moment at 35,000 feet. What had started as a simple training program born from an embarrassing mistake had grown into an international movement, touching lives across continents and cultures. She opened her laptop and began working on her presentation for next week's International Airline Conference in Dubai. Her story wasn't just about spilled coffee anymore. It was about how one moment of genuine human connection could spark a global revolution in customer service. As she wrote, she smiled, thinking about how many more stories were yet to be created, how many more lives would be touched, all because of one fateful cup of coffee and the lessons learned from it. 2 years after the coffee incident, Alex found herself back where it all began, on a flight from Chicago to San Francisco. But this time, she wasn't serving passengers. She was on her way to receive the International Aviation Service Excellence Award, the industry's highest honor for contributions to customer service innovation. As she settled into her seat, she couldn't help but notice the familiar movements of the flight attendants, now all graduates of her training program. They moved through the cabin with the perfect balance of professionalism and warmth she'd worked so hard to instill. Watching them, she felt like a proud teacher observing her students. The flight attendant serving her section did a double take when she realized who Alex was. "You're the one from the coffee story," she exclaimed quietly. "We still talk about that in every training session. You have no idea how many of us you've inspired." Alex smiled, remembering how that story had taken on a life of its own. It had been translated into dozens of languages, adapted for training programs across 6 continents, and even featured in international business magazines as a case study in turning mistakes into opportunities. During the flight, she opened her laptop to review her acceptance speech for the award ceremony. The words on the screen blurred as she thought about the incredible journey of the past 2 years. Her training program had now certified over 10,000 flight attendants worldwide, and Pacific Airways had become known as the industry leader in customer service. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their final approach to San Francisco. Alex looked out the window at the familiar skyline, remembering her first nervous visit to the corporate headquarters. Now, she regularly gave presentations in that same building to aviation executives from around the world. At the award ceremony that evening, the grand ballroom of the San Francisco Aviation Center was packed with industry leaders. Mr. Chen, now chairman of the board, had insisted on introducing her himself. 2 years ago, he began, a cup of coffee changed the aviation industry. The audience chuckled. But it wasn't really about the coffee. It was about how one person's response to a simple mistake showed us what true service excellence looks like. As Alex took the stage to accept her award, she saw faces in the audience from every corner of the globe: airline executives from Dubai who had implemented her program, flight attendants from Singapore who had translated her materials, trainers from Brazil who had adapted her methods for their market. "When I started this journey," she began, holding her award, "I was just trying to recover from what I thought was the biggest mistake of my career. But what I learned, what we've all learned, is that service excellence isn't about being perfect. It's about being genuinely human." She went on to share stories from around the world, how her program had helped airlines connect with passengers across cultural and language barriers, how it had improved job satisfaction among flight crews, and most importantly, how it had made flying a more human experience for millions of passengers. After the ceremony, during the reception, a young flight attendant approached her with tears in her eyes. "Last month, I had a passenger who was terrified of flying," she said. "I used what you taught us about connecting with passengers on a human level. By the end of the flight, she was calm and even smiling. That's when I truly understood what your training was all about." Later that evening, Mr. Chen found Alex on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. "You know what the best part of spilling that coffee was?" he asked. "It showed me exactly who you were, someone who cared more about the person than the position. That's what this industry needed." As the night drew to a close, Alex received news that would mark the beginning of her next chapter. The International Aviation Board wanted her to head a new global initiative for standardizing customer service training across all airlines. Her methods would become the industry standard. The next morning, as she packed her bags in her hotel room, Alex found an old name tag from her flight attendant days. She ran her fingers over the embossed letters, remembering the nervous young woman who had spilled that fateful cup of coffee. On her flight home, she began drafting plans for the global initiative. As she wrote, a flight attendant served her coffee. They both laughed as a slight turbulence shook the plane. "Don't worry," Alex said with a wink, "I've learned that sometimes spilled coffee can be the beginning of something wonderful." Looking out the window at the clouds below, Alex reflected on how a single moment had created ripples that continued to spread across the aviation industry. Her story had become more than just a training example, it had become a symbol of how embracing our human moments, even our mistakes, can lead to extraordinary changes. As the plane soared through the sky, Alex thought about all the flights taking place at that very moment, all the flight attendants trained in her methods, all the passengers experiencing the kind of genuine care and attention she had always believed in. She realized that while her journey had started with a spilled cup of coffee, it had grown into something far more meaningful, a transformation in how people treat each other, not just in the skies, but everywhere. The captain announced their final approach, and Alex closed her laptop. Her story wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. But she had learned that sometimes the best journeys start with a mistake, and the most important destinations aren't places on a map, but moments of human connection that change us forever. 5 years after that life-changing coffee spill, Alex stood in front of a full auditorium at the Global Aviation Summit in Singapore. The audience included airline executives, flight attendants, and customer service professionals from every major carrier in the world. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she couldn't help but marvel at how far a single moment of adversity had carried her. The giant screen behind her displayed the title of her keynote speech, The Ripple Effect: How One Moment Can Transform an Industry. But today's presentation was special. It would be her last as Pacific Airways Global Training Director before taking on her new role as the founder of the International Aviation Service Institute. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying through the silent auditorium, I thought I had made the biggest mistake of my career. Today, I realize it wasn't a mistake at all, it was an opportunity disguised as a disaster. The audience chuckled, many of them familiar with the now famous coffee story. As she spoke, Alex shared the latest statistics. Over 50,000 flight attendants trained worldwide, customer satisfaction scores at record highs across participating airlines, and a revolutionary approach to service that had transformed the aviation industry. But more importantly, she shared the human stories, countless moments where genuine care had made a difference in passengers' lives. During her speech, she noticed Mr. Chen sitting in the front row. Now semi-retired, he had made a special appearance for this occasion. He smiled knowingly as she referenced their first encounter, both of them remembering how a simple cup of coffee had sparked a global movement in customer service. But today, Alex continued, I want to share something new. Something that shows the true impact of what we've created together. She clicked to the next slide, revealing a collection of photographs sent in by flight attendants and passengers from around the world. Each image captured a moment of genuine human connection at 35,000 feet. There was a picture of a flight attendant comforting an elderly passenger during turbulence, another of a crew member celebrating a child's first flight, and countless other moments that demonstrated how the principles of her training program had touched lives in ways she never imagined. After her presentation, during the reception, a group of young flight attendants from various airlines approached her. One of them spoke up, your story gave us permission to be human in our jobs. To see beyond the procedures and really connect with our passengers. Later that evening, at a small gathering of industry leaders, Mr. Chen made an announcement that brought tears to Alex's eyes. Pacific Airways was establishing the Alexandra Thompson Service Excellence Scholarship, which would provide opportunities for aspiring flight attendants from underprivileged backgrounds to receive world-class training. Alex showed us that exceptional service isn't about perfection, Mr. Chen said, raising his glass. It's about turning everyday moments into extraordinary experiences. This scholarship will ensure her legacy continues to shape the future of aviation. As Alex looked around the room, she saw faces from every corner of the globe, people who had taken her story and used it to transform their own airlines, their own lives, and the experiences of countless passengers. The coffee spill that once made her fear for her job had become a catalyst for global change. The next morning, as she prepared to board her flight home, Alex received an email that perfectly encapsulated her journey. It was from a passenger who had recently flown on one of Pacific Airways' routes. The passenger described how a flight attendant had helped her through a panic attack during severe turbulence, showing such genuine care and empathy that it had changed her entire perspective on flying. The flight attendant told me about you, the email read, about how you taught them that their real job isn't just serving drinks or giving safety demonstrations. it's being present in people's lives during their journeys. I wanted you to know that your vision of service excellence didn't just change the aviation industry, it changed lives, one flight at a time. As Alex settled into her seat for the long flight home, she reflected on the past 5 years. Her new institute would take everything she'd learned and expand it beyond aviation, teaching organizations across industries how to create genuine human connections in an increasingly digital world. The flight attendant serving her section approached with a coffee pot. They shared a knowing smile as she carefully poured the cup. "Extra careful with this one," the attendant said with a wink. "Though I heard it can lead to amazing things." Looking out at the sunset through the airplane window, Alex thought about all the flights taking off at that moment around the world. Each one carried not just passengers, but stories, dreams, fears, and hopes. And thanks to a moment that could have ended her career, there were now thousands of trained professionals ready to be part of those stories, to turn ordinary moments into extraordinary memories. As the plane lifted into the darkening sky, Alex opened her laptop to begin working on the curriculum for her new institute. The principles she'd developed, genuine care, human connection, turning mistakes into opportunities, weren't just about airline service anymore. They were about something much bigger, the power of human kindness to transform lives, one moment at a time. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their cruising altitude, and Alex smiled, remembering how every great journey starts with a single step, or in her case, a single spill. Her story had become more than just a training example, it had become a testament to the extraordinary power of embracing our human moments, even the ones that seem like disasters at first. The future stretched out before her like the endless sky outside her window, full of new possibilities and opportunities to share her message with the world. And somewhere out there, on countless flights crossing the globe, her legacy continued to touch lives, one human connection at a time.